I would like to read the bio of our presenter. He was kind enough to mail this to me, so I didn't have to make up any stories about him. So, since 1999, Tom Durkin has served as Deputy Director of the NASA South Dakota Space Grant Consortium, headquarters on the campus of the School of Mines. His duties consist of administering educational activities in the fields of science, technology, engineering, and math, supported by NASA's unique mission. He provides support and guidance for university students funded by this space grant, including those who conduct internships and eventually gain employment at NASA centers and aerospace industries. Tom received a BS degree in Earth Science from Adelphi University in New York and an MS degree in Geology from the School of Mines. Today he will speak to us about the 50th anniversary of manned Apollo spaceflight and that amazing first mission to land on the moon, Apollo 11.
All right, thank you. Appreciate it. Yeah. Well, all right. Well, I'm glad Lee invited me to come to speak with you tonight. So, as he said, this talk will be a talk on the history of the Apollo missions, focusing mostly on Apollo 11. But what I'm doing, and Lee, you might be interested because I'd be available for maybe some of your future presentations, I'm giving actually 4 different talks throughout the 50th anniversary of the manned Apollo space flights. And I gave the first one just a few months ago, well actually in December, when we passed the 50th anniversary of Apollo 8, and actually Apollo 7, which was in October. And then today's talk will be still giving an introduction of what led up to the Apollo missions. That'll be about half the talk. About the space race and what led up to the eventual Apollo missions. And then I'll just very quickly mention the Apollo 7 and 8, 9 and 10, and then focus mostly on Apollo 11, which was the first landing. But what I'll do, Lee, is next year I'll give a talk on Apollo 13.
Okay.
And that'll cover Apollo 12 and 13, but mostly Apollo 13. And I could come and give that at the library. And then maybe a year or so after that, I'll do the last 3 Apollo missions, 14, 15, 16, and 17. So it'll actually be 4 Apollo missions. And all of those were manned. Everything was manned since Apollo 7. So with that as an intro, we can start with just kind of a picture of the target and the moon. And this is actually a telescope image from Earth of the moon, but a pretty good one. And just very briefly, a little history or a little background on the moon. The regular daily and monthly rhythms of Earth's only natural satellite, the moon, have guided timekeepers for thousands of years. Its influence on Earth cycles, notably the tides, has also been charted by many cultures in many ages. More than 70 spacecraft have been sent to the moon, not all just from the United States, but several others. And of course, not all of them were manned. 12 astronauts have walked on its surface and brought back a little over 840 pounds of lunar rock and soil to the Earth. The moon, the presence of the moon, stabilizes Earth's wobble. This has led to a much more stable climate over billions of years. How did the moon come to be? Well, the leading theory is that long ago, a Mars-sized body once hit the Earth, and the debris that resulted from that impact, from both the Earth and the impacting body, accumulated to form the moon. And from Earth, it's interesting, we see only the same side of the moon from the vantage point of Earth, even though the moon does spin around on its axis like the Earth does. Of course, the Earth's rotation period, or revolution period, is 24 hours, right? So I've drawn a blue dot on this baseball here, and picture the Earth as my finger. Well, the moon does actually spin around on its axis, but it also orbits the Earth, right? And it does so at nearly the same amount of time for both, about every 27.3 days. This is called synchronous rotation. So if we're here on Earth looking at the moon and the moon did not rotate, we'd see the blue dot here, but when the moon came around here, we wouldn't see it. So this is slowly turning at the same amount of time that it takes to get around the Earth. So at any point in its orbit, the blue dot is facing Earth. And that's called synchronous rotation, and that's why you only see one side of the moon. And this is imagery of the moon from the Earth over a month's period from full moon to full moon. And again, you can see how we just don't see the far side of the moon. We don't call it the dark side because it does spin around. So it has light for roughly 13 and a half days, but not from our vantage point. Now, back in the 60s and 50s, we were in a space race with the Soviet Union for technological superiority, and in particular, technological superiority to be able to get to space, right? So it was a race at which we were losing several early components of that race to the Soviets. They beat us, for example, with the first satellite in space, Sputnik, in 1957. We followed just a few weeks later. They beat us with the first human being up into space. Not to go to the moon or orbit the Earth, but just to go up far enough to leave the atmosphere and come back down again. And you all remember who that was, right? Who was that? Yuri Gagarin, right. And a few weeks later, we did it with Alan Shepard. So what happened was President Kennedy realized that we really needed to speed up and get a little better at those various stages of the race. So he gave a very famous speech to a joint session of Congress in 1961 and charged our country with the challenge of sending a man to the moon and returning him safely to the Earth by the end of the decade, which, when he gave this speech in May of 1961, was about 8.5 years away. So I'm going to play just part of that speech.
I therefore ask the Congress, above and beyond the increases I have earlier requested for space activities, to provide the funds which are needed to meet the following national goals. First, I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. No single space project in this period will be more impressive to mankind or more important for the long-range exploration of space, and none will be so difficult or expensive to accomplish. We propose to accelerate the development of the appropriate lunar spacecraft. We propose to develop alternate liquid and solid fuel boosters, much larger than any now being developed, until certain which is superior. We propose additional funds for other engine development and for unmanned exploration, explorations which are particularly important for one purpose which this nation will never overlook: the survival of the man who first makes this daring flight. But in a very real sense, it will not be one man going to the moon. We make this judgment affirmatively. It will be an entire nation, for all of us must work to put him there. Secondly, an additional $23 million,
Stop the tape
together
there.
with $7 million.
And let's continue with the slides. So that was the bold challenge that President Kennedy gave our country, and the Congress agreed with the idea and approved it, and off we went. Oops, let's see, why did that happen? Go back up here. There we are. Okay, so that brings us up then to the need to get astronauts to go into space. So this is a picture of the early first 7 Mercury astronauts. Before we could even build the Apollo spacecraft, we had to build more simple spacecraft. And we had to build rockets to get those spacecraft up into space. So I'll just read you a little history of that early part of the space program. In 1958, John Glenn and about 508 other astronaut candidates participated in a series of tests designed to select the first group of astronauts for the newly formed NASA manned space program. Each astronaut candidate from this original pool of 508 people had to meet 7 criteria. First, They had to be test pilot school graduates. They had to be in excellent physical shape, less than 40 years old, shorter than 5 feet 11 inches. They had to be qualified jet pilots. They had to have at least 1,500 hours of flying time. And lastly, they had to have a bachelor's degree in engineering. So if they met all of those requirements, they could apply to be an astronaut. And out of those 500 and some, these 7 were chosen. And from left, they're in their street clothes, standing in front of a Mercury capsule, which had only held 1 astronaut. We eventually had to get capsules large enough to hold 3 astronauts for Apollo. But going from left to right here, we start with Gordon Cooper, and then you can barely see him, but Walter Schirra, Alan Shepard, who was the first American in space to follow Yuri Gagarin, Gus Grissom, who was tragically killed in the Apollo 1 fire. He went on to become an Apollo astronaut, but never got off the ground. John Glenn, who made his famous orbit, first American to orbit the Earth, and he went on to become a senator. Deke Slayton and Scott Carpenter. Now, this is a picture of Alan Shepard aboard his Mercury capsule. Here you see the Mercury capsule right at the top of a Mercury Redstone rocket. Now, each of the Mercury astronauts were able to name their capsule. And the name that Alan Shepard chose for his was Freedom. So every one of the capsules then had the number 7 after it, recognizing the 7 Mercury astronauts. So his was Freedom 7. And this is the launch of his capsule. You can see it was just a launch up to a little past 125 miles. This is beyond the atmosphere of Earth and considered space. And then it was launched at Cape Canaveral, which is now called Kennedy Space Center. It went up out over the Atlantic Ocean. It was a 15-minute flight, and it splashed down in the Atlantic. So it only lasted about 15 minutes. But he was the first American in space. And here they're picking him up in the recovery helicopter, put him on an aircraft carrier, and bring him back. And I'm just showing you just a few examples of the Mercury missions. But this is John Glenn. The name that he chose for his capsule was Friendship 7. And remember now, this is a race between the United States and the Soviets. So the Soviets were a socialist country, a communist country. Okay, people weren't free. And the United States, of course, and democratic society is free. So freedom and friendship. You can see the theme that they've got here. Here's several of the Mercury astronauts in their suits. John Glenn getting ready to get into his capsule. His flight would orbit the Earth, the first time an American did that. So here he is getting into Friendship 7. Just another picture of the 7 of them in their suits. But again, here's John Glenn getting into Friendship 7. This was the 6th Mercury mission, Mercury 6, with the capsule Friendship 7. That's the mission patch. John Glenn, the astronaut on board. Here's the launch of his Friendship 7 capsule aboard an Atlas rocket this time, February 20th, 1962. So this is just about 7 months after President Kennedy's speech. And here you can see the mission controllers in Houston tracking the path of the spacecraft as it orbits the Earth. At that orbital altitude, the spacecraft travels at about 17,500 miles an hour. So it takes about an hour and a half to orbit the Earth once. He went around 3 times, which meant he was up in space for about 4.5 hours. And it was a very successful flight. Let's see. Yeah, okay. And so here's just a picture of him afterwards receiving the prestigious NASA Service Award from President Kennedy. There were several Mercury missions. Then we developed the Gemini missions, Gemini for twins. In this case, the capsule had a compartment for 2 astronauts. So we're getting closer to what we need for Apollo. And the only one of the 10 manned Gemini missions that I'm going to show you is this slide. And it just shows the launch of Gemini 8, and it is aboard a Titan II missile, or Titan II rocket. And March 1966. Interestingly, if you look at this astronaut, upon splashdown of a successful mission, you may recognize him. It's Neil Armstrong, who went on to become the first human to step foot on the moon in Apollo 11, which we'll get to in a minute. And I just thought that was interesting. Several of the Apollo astronauts were also Gemini astronauts. And one of them was even a Mercury astronaut. Okay. Now I'm just going to go through several slides fairly quickly. And the thing that I want you to pay attention to in these slides, they'll be relatively chronological, is notice the dates on the slides and the different rocket launches and how quickly the rocket design is improving in technology, in the size of the rocket, and the power of the rocket. Amazing how the amount of rocket development that we were able to do in a short amount of time to meet President Kennedy's goal. Okay, so this is back in 1962 with a relatively simple rocket on the launch pad at Cape Canaveral, which was eventually named Kennedy Space Center in honor of President Kennedy after he was assassinated. This is a view of Missile Row. This is Launch Complex 14 here, where several of the rockets were launched. There's one getting ready for launch. But because we were testing so many different rocket designs and launching so many of them so quickly, we couldn't just have one launch facility. It'd take too long to get it ready for the next one. So they had to build lots of launch facilities, launch pads. This is 1963. Here's a picture in 64 showing the same view, showing Missile Row here. And a launch facility right over here too. The large building where they built the rockets was called the VAB, or VAB, stands for Vehicle Assembly Building, where they assembled the rockets. That's way over here. And it doesn't look very big from this picture, but I'm going to show you a close-up. And then, of course, they roll out the rockets on this giant crawler. It was very slow, but it would roll the rockets out, and they would drive it out, and they'd maybe go to this launch facility, this one here, they'd come down, maybe they're going to go to this one over here, and they could line these rockets up and test them relatively quickly. This is the Vehicle Assembly Building. More closer up, this is one of the Saturn rockets, not a Saturn V, but one of the Saturn rockets, 1964, on the crawler. And the size is just unbelievable. That, I think, is a person. Right there, that little dot. So, just unbelievable, the size of the equipment. And for the longest time, this was the largest building in the world. Not the tallest, but the largest building in terms of square footage inside. Of course, the tallest building back then was the, what? We're talking 1960s. I'm from New York, so that's a hint. Empire State Building. Okay, so, but there was much more square footage available in this building. So for the longest time, it literally was the biggest building in the world. Now this I'm not going to go all through, but I'm just going to show you, there were 17 Apollo missions. The manned missions are the ones below this. So this block of missions were manned all the way from Apollo 7 to Apollo 17. These were the unmanned missions up here, okay? What would have been Apollo 1 through Apollo 6. But there's this one that's out of place chronologically. It was a manned mission, but it took off, these dates are all chronological here, all the way down. It took off in between these three and these three, or it was supposed to take off. This was renamed Apollo 1 in honor of the 3 astronauts who were killed as a result of the fire that broke out during a test while the Apollo 1 spacecraft was on the launch pad. It was not scheduled to launch that day, it was a test, but a fire broke out and it killed the astronauts. So the reason this is out of sequence is because it was formally named Apollo 1, even though it wasn't the first unmanned Apollo mission that was launched. And we'll see some pictures of that when the time comes. But here is the launch of what would have been Apollo 1. It's an unmanned mission. It's the first flight of the Saturn 1B stage, which was just part of what would eventually be a multi-stage Saturn rocket needed to go to the moon. This February 1966. The next, was just a few months later, about 3 months later, in July of 1966, what would have been Apollo 2. In August, just 2 months after that, what would have been Apollo 3 was launched, an unmanned rocket. And Apollo 3 was let's see, that was an unmanned test of the rocket's reliability. I guess the rocket for firing more than once. And then we get to what was renamed Apollo 1. So here we have a picture where these gentlemen here are, this is the top of the rocket. This is basically the capsule that the astronauts would get into, and below it is a big rocket. So they're on top of the launch gantry coming in this door, and they're getting ready to go into the capsule for a test run. So what we're looking at here, entering the capsule, is Gus Grissom, Virgil Gus Grissom, commander. Behind him is Roger Chaffee, and then over to the left here is Ed White. He would have been the command module pilot. This is a picture of the three of them 10 days before the tragic fire, January 1967, for a press photo. In a spacecraft review meeting held with the Apollo spacecraft program office manager Joseph Shea on August 19, 1966, the crew expressed concern about the amount of flammable material, namely nylon netting and Velcro, in the cabin, which the technicians found convenient for holding tools and equipment in place when the spacecraft was in space and in zero gravity. Velcro. Shea gave his staff orders to tell North American Aviation, who was the contractor that built the command service module and the lunar module, to remove the flammable materials from the cabin, but he did not supervise the issue personally. So space travel, of course, was dangerous. Everybody knew a lot of the rockets and the unmanned missions, they blow up. So if there was any people on board, they'd have been killed. So one of the reporters asked Gus Grissom about what he thought about the dangers of being an astronaut. And this is what he said. He said, quote, "You sort of have to put that out of your mind. There's always the possibility you could have a catastrophic failure, of course. This can happen on any flight. It can happen on the last one as well as the first one. So you just plan as best you can to take care of all these eventualities, and you get a well-trained crew, and you go fly." That's the attitude that you have to be an astronaut. Well, then in January 27th, that test was occurring. At that time, NASA had the astronauts breathe an atmosphere inside the sealed cabin of 100% pure oxygen, which of course they don't do anymore, right? So here, if I lit a match in this room, the match would burn, right? Because the oxygen's only about 20% in our atmosphere. But if you have an atmosphere of 100% pure oxygen and there's a spark or a flame, it will ignite anything that is flammable in the room because it's explosive, really. And that's what happened. There was a spark from one of the electrical wires, and a fire broke out in the cabin, and the three astronauts were killed very quickly. Real tragedy. So it's dangerous being an astronaut. This is the flag-draped coffin of Gus Grissom as it's being escorted at Arlington National Cemetery by his fellow astronauts. From left to right here, we see Alan Shepard, John Glenn, Gordon Cooper, and John Young. February 1967. So that set back things a little bit. Then, let's see, this was the launch of Apollo 4, November 1967. So this is like close to 9 months later, I guess. It's another unmanned mission, okay? This is the launch of Apollo 4. Then, in January of 68, just a couple months later, we have the launch of Apollo 5. It also was an early evening launch. That's a picture of the launch. And that was a test of the lunar module, which was aboard the top of the rocket. And then the final unmanned mission was Apollo 6. This was in, let's see, This is the flight control room actually at Johnson Space Center. I'm sorry, Kennedy Space Center in Florida. And this is the launch of Apollo 6 on April 4th, 1968. Happens to be my anniversary. I married that year, but that's my anniversary, 4/4. So this was the final man-rating test of a Saturn rocket. Then we get to the first manned mission, which just passed its 50th anniversary last October with the launch of Apollo 7. And now the mission patches have names on them, the names of the astronauts. And from left to right here, we see Don Isley, or I'm sorry, this is Walter Cunningham, Don Isley, and Walter Schirra. Look at the Volkswagen Bug and the Corvair. 1968, October 11th, 1968. And I won't give a lot of details there, but I gave a talk with a lot more information on 7 and 8 in my last series of talks, but this is just a picture I really like of the launch of Apollo 7. The Saturn's first stage separated more than 2 minutes after the launch, and the second stage then, the S-4B part of the rocket immediately took over. Commander Wally Schirra reported back to Mission Control, she is riding like a dream. Over 10 minutes after the launch, Apollo 7 achieved orbit around the Earth. So it did not go to the moon. It just orbited around the Earth. And here's the 3 astronauts about 11 days later as they're picked up by the recovery helicopter and on the deck of the aircraft carrier USS Essex. Then we get to Apollo 8, which is a very famous flight. This was the first manned Apollo mission that went to the moon. Didn't land, we orbited the moon. And orbited on Christmas Eve, 1968. The astronauts are Jim Lovell, who also went on Apollo 13, Bill Anders, and Frank Borman. And this is interesting. The success of earlier flights, problems in the development of the lunar module, and concerns that the Soviet Union might be ready to launch astronauts around the moon led NASA to change the flight plan for the next Saturn V mission, Apollo 8. NASA ultimately changed from an unpiloted Earth orbiting mission to a crewed flight around the moon. That's a huge change.
Yeah.
Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and Bill Anders were the first crew to fly atop the powerful Saturn V booster, ultimately spending 20 hours orbiting the moon. On Christmas Eve 1968, the crew gave a memorable reading from the book of Genesis, and while in orbit, Bill Anders took the iconic Earthrise photo, which I'll show you in a close-up here in a minute. What's that?
There's a lot of talk about that where I was.
Yeah, I bet there is.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
So here we see a picture just before they're getting ready to go out to the rocket. The crew all suited up, leaving the suiting room to catch a van that will take them to launch pad A, pad 39A. There's the rocket rating for them. Here's the launch, December 21st, 1968. Took 3 days to get to the moon. Here are the flight controllers in Mission's Operation Control Room at Mission Control in Houston. This is the 3rd day of the Apollo 8 lunar orbit. You can see the television camera here. It's showing a picture of Earth from the astronaut's viewpoint. It was telecast across the country, across the world, when the spacecraft was about 176,000 miles away from Earth. So it's about 3/4 of the way to the moon at this point. The moon's about 240,000 miles from Earth. The next day, they would go into orbit around the moon. So this is December 23rd. Now, the next day, when they achieve orbit, they fire the rockets to slow it down as it approaches the moon and put it into a lunar orbit. So they actually have to fire the rockets to slow the spacecraft down so that the moon's gravity can catch it and not just fly on by the moon. And we knew that there would be a loss of signal that occurred once the astronauts, if this is the moon here, and Earth is back here, and the astronauts are coming up and they do that orbital insertion burn, slow it down, and they go around the backside of the moon, all of a sudden they are no longer in radio contact with the Earth. So there was a loss of signals at 68 hours, 58 minutes into the mission. Yeah, everybody knew that would happen. At that moment, those 3 astronauts became the first human beings to see the far side of the moon. And I'll show you some pictures now. Some of these were taken of the far side. I won't go into this long description, but this was taken on the first orbit on Christmas Eve 1968 that the astronauts took outside, looking out their window. And you can see the craters, and there's a lot of, from a geologist standpoint, there's a lot of information. You can see these long lines that called rills that go all the way through this crater up over the mountains of the crater rim and on. These type of geological pieces of evidence give us an indication of when things formed on the moon. What formed first, what formed second, etc. This is a picture taken during the second orbit. This large 68-mile diameter crater here is called Doppler crater. And the formation of every large crater generates a huge number of smaller secondary craters. So you can imagine the large meteor that came in and impacted the moon here to form this crater throws out a lot of ejecta, smaller rocks, that then hit and form craters of their own, even little ones. From Mission Control in Houston, spacecraft communicator Jerry Carr, who was a fellow astronaut still back on Earth, asked the crew, "What does the old moon look like from 60 miles?" Anders radioed back, "Like dirty beach sand with lots of footprints on it." And this is the third orbit on Christmas Eve that night. And this particular view made me think of a description of the moon that Buzz Aldrin would give it 7 months later when he actually walked on the surface of the moon in Apollo 11. And you see how barren it is, how desolate it is. It looks like a desert, there's nothing growing. Aldrin's description of it was magnificent desolation.
Did they walk on the back side of the moon, or did they walk on the front? Probably
The Sea of Tranquility was on the front, on the Earth-facing side, right? So we could stay in communication, right? So on the fourth orbit, something very special popped into view as Apollo 8 was in its fourth orbit around the Earth. And it wasn't expected. The astronauts didn't know it was coming. It was the Earth, okay? So as they're going over the moon this way, the Earth is coming up over the horizon. So at 75 hours, 47 minutes, and 44 seconds into the mission, astronaut Bill Anders snaps this black and white photo of Earth rising above the lunar surface. You are looking at the very first photograph ever taken of the Earth from the distance of the moon. Very quickly after he snapped this photo, in a matter of just a few seconds, the astronauts grabbed a roll of color film and captured what has become an iconic image. This is the Earthrise image in color. And I'll read you a little history of this particular image. The Earthrise photo was taken during the Apollo 8 mission on Christmas Eve, 1968. The photograph was not on the mission schedule and was taken in a moment of pure serendipity, pure chance. They just happened to see it out the window. The windows aren't real big, and they saw it coming up and took this picture. It's an image so powerful and eloquent that even today it ranks as one of the most important photographs ever taken by anyone. U.S. nature photographer Galen Roll has described this image as, quote, the most influential environmental photograph ever taken. As Apollo 8 traveled outward, the crew focused a portable television camera on Earth, and for the first time, humanity saw its home from afar, a tiny, lovely, and fragile blue marble hanging in the blackness of space. When it arrived at the moon on Christmas Eve, this image of Earth was even more strongly reinforced when the crew sent images of the planet back while reading the first part of the Bible that astronaut Frank Borman had brought with him, before they sent their individual Christmas greetings back to humanity. Borman's final words were perhaps the most moving. And I can actually remember this. I was 10 years old. I was back in New York at that time. I was one of about 1 billion people who were either listening on the radio to this broadcast or watching on TV. And Borman wrapped up and he said, quote, "And from the crew of Apollo 8, we pause with good night, good luck, a Merry Christmas, and God bless all of you on the good earth." The next day, they fired the boosters for a return flight and splashed down in the Pacific Ocean on the 27th of December. It was an enormously significant accomplishment coming at a time when American society was in crisis over Vietnam, race relations, urban problems, and a host of other difficulties. And if only for a few moments, the nation united as one to focus on this epical event. And I'd go so far as to say, really, it was the whole world that united at that special moment. Because everybody, in addition to just the astronauts, saw this beautiful little blue marble that we all live on together. You know, and I think sometimes if we think of it from this perspective and remind ourselves of it, it's interesting, you know, you listen to the account of the way things were back then. It doesn't sound that different than if you turn the news on today. But I do think that if we kind of think about the impact that realization had on everyone around the world, maybe people would learn to get along with each other a little better than we do sometimes. And the Postal Service made a special stamp in commemoration of Apollo 8. 6 cents. And here's the Apollo 8 splashdown. The crew picked up, brought to the USS Yorktown aircraft carrier after an incredibly successful mission. All right. So then we had Apollo 9 just about 3 months later in March of 1969. That was a test of the lunar module in Earth orbit. And then we had Apollo 10 2 months after that, in May of '69. That was a test of the lunar module in lunar orbit. So in this case, you see the command module, which has the lunar module attached to a certain stage of the rocket where it actually then undocks. And eventually that lunar module in Apollo 11 is going to have to descend to the surface of the moon while the command module stays in orbit around the moon. All right? So they tested that first in Earth orbit. So you see here's the lunar module taken from the astronaut out the window of the command module looking down at it. Disengaged and undocked, and then it redocked to show that we could do it. You see the Earth in the background, the ocean. Did the exact same thing 2 months later in Apollo 10, only this was now in lunar orbit. So Apollo 8 and Apollo 10 orbited the moon, did not land. And you see out the window of the command module, the picture of the lunar module. Then we get to Apollo 11. And what's missing, I'll show you these other two mission patches here. Here's one, here's the other, Apollo 9 and 10. What's missing on the Apollo 11 mission patch? Names, right. So it was interesting because Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Mike Collins, the 3 astronauts on Apollo 11, realized that it was thousands of people that got them to that point in time, that point in history, to become the first human beings to go to the moon, 2 of which would walk on the surface. So they, in a very humble act, decided to leave their names off the mission patch so everybody could take credit for Apollo 11. And of course, the name that they chose for their lunar module to first land on the moon was the Eagle. So the Eagle was the lead feature in the mission patch. And what's the Eagle carrying in his talons? Anybody know what that is? What type of vegetation that is? It's an olive branch, to show that we come in peace for all mankind. The primary objective of Apollo 11 was to complete a national goal set by President Kennedy about 8 years earlier, to perform a crewed lunar landing and return to Earth. Additional flight objectives included scientific exploration by the lunar module, crew deployment of a television camera to transmit signals to Earth from the moon, and deployment of a solar wind composition experiment. Also, a seismic experiment package and a laser ranging retroreflector. Those were kind of like secondary goals or objectives of that mission. During the exploration, the two astronauts, Armstrong and Aldrin, were to gather samples of lunar surface materials for return to Earth. They were also to extensively photograph the lunar terrain, to photograph the scientific equipment that they set out on the moon, the lunar module itself, and each other with regular cameras and motion picture cameras. Apollo 11 was the last Apollo mission to fly a free return trajectory to the moon. This free return trajectory allows a return to Earth with no engine firing. So if the engines didn't fire when it was going around the moon, to slow it down, to put it into that lunar insertion orbit, they didn't need the engine to do that. The way that they flew this one to the moon, they projected it in such a way, at such a distance from the moon, that even if the rocket didn't ignite that time at the moon's gravity would grab a hold of the Apollo 11 spacecraft, slingshot around the other side, and send it back to Earth. Free return trajectory. After Apollo 11, we figured we had a pretty good handle on the rockets, and they did not fly that free return trajectory any longer. Kind of interesting. And here's a picture of the crew in a training exercise about 2 months before the launch. Here we have Buzz Aldrin, Neil Armstrong, and Mike Collins. Mike was the one who stayed in the lunar command module in orbit around the moon.
Was that controversial, which one got to go down and land and which one stayed up?
Yep, and that was decided. You know, the astronauts couldn't decide that themselves. They had bosses, and they picked. They had a lot of different criteria that they looked at for, you know, which astronaut would take which job, what would be their responsibilities based on their experience and their training. And
Actually, Collins was just interviewed on TV here within the last month or so.
yep, what did he say?
Well, they asked him about that, and he said, hey, you know, we all contributed.
Right.
He said he would like to, but he didn't have any last finger scratch.
Right. I also remember years ago I heard an interview with him, and he said he actually really enjoyed being up there alone, looking out at the moon. Those guys are down there doing all that work, and he's just sitting up there relaxing, enjoying the view, and totally alone. You know, it's just interesting. So here's just a press photos of all three astronauts, Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Mike Collins. And here is the descent and landing white team of flight controllers. So the teams had colors. Obviously, it's a 24-hour operation. You've got to staff the mission control room. So they had blue teams, red teams, green teams. This was the white team, which was present for the actual descent and landing of the lunar modules to the lunar surface. And you notice something in common. They all have white shirts, black ties, and a pocket protector, which I am doing in honor of the flight operators. So,
I'm glad you explained that.
and this is Gene Kranz, the flight director, right in the middle. He was flight director for Apollo 13 also. Amazing story. And here's the Apollo 11 Saturn V rocket being rolled out of the vehicle assembly building. Notice the date, May 10th, 1969. It didn't launch until July 21st of July 16th of 1969, you know, 2 months later. At the time this was rolling out of the vehicle assembly building, Apollo 10 was in orbit around the moon. Amazing. So they're bringing it out to the launch pad. Here's a picture of it about 2 weeks before launch, approaching the launch gantry, still on the giant crawler that will bring it up and attach it to the launch gantry. And here's the liftoff on July 16th, 1969 of Apollo 11. There's a new movie now. I just actually downloaded it last night. It's called Apollo 11 with really high definition imagery of the Apollo 11 mission. It's like a documentary, but if you want to see real images of it, you can download that from Amazon.
Apollo 11, you say?
Yes, it's called Apollo 11, and it's the new one. It's the one that was made this year, 2019. There's a couple others called Apollo 11, but this is the newest one. And I include this just to show the flight trajectory. This obviously is not to scale, because if the Earth was this big, the moon would be way out over here. But you can see basically the circulating pattern. So the spacecraft launches from Earth, goes in orbit around the Earth, and then fires a rocket to speed it up from 17,500 miles an hour to upwards of like 24,000 some odd miles an hour to leave the Earth orbit and go on this free return trajectory toward the moon. And then they do several orbits around the moon. The lunar module undocks with the command module, goes down to the surface, comes back up, redocks, and then they do another burn to speed the spacecraft up and send it back to Earth. So this is just the landing phase and the ascent phase from the moon, and all the different things that had to happen along the way, and I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. But the spacecraft launched, it parked itself in orbit around the Earth, the different stages of the rocket had to break off. Over here at stage 7, there was the lunar injection, let's see what they call that, it was a burn of the engine basically to speed it up to about 24,000 miles and send it away from the Earth on the way to the moon. At different stages along the way, the command module had to actually undock from this stage of the rocket, turn itself around, and dock with the lunar module. And then that paired double made its way to the moon. And then it got in orbit around the moon, and then at one point, the lunar module undocked from the command module, which stayed in orbit around the moon, and the lunar module went down to the surface. And that's number 17, and then here it is, number 18. After they do all their work they're done with their work on the surface of the moon, they launch the top of the lunar module. It goes back up into orbit around the moon, redocks with the command module, and brings all 3 astronauts back to Earth. That's a little complicated. Here's some pictures of the crew. This is a picture that Neil Armstrong took of Buzz Aldrin on the day of the landing, but before the actual descent. And then this is a picture that Buzz took of Neil on the same day after they completed their historic spacewalk. Or moonwalk, I should say. And this is the Earthrise image from Apollo 11. And this is just a picture of what the astronauts saw as they're orbiting the moon. Not a good place to land. Too many holes, too many mountains, too many rocks. So they have to continue over to a smooth area, to the Sea of Tranquility. They descend the lunar module, land safely with 16 seconds of fuel left. That's how much fuel Neil Armstrong used to find a smooth enough area to land on. They had actually overshot their planned landing zone. So he had to look at the surface, had to literally look out the window and pilot the lunar module down to an area that wouldn't land in a crater on top of a big rock. And he knew exactly how much fuel he had. He was watching that, and he was finding the best possible spot he could find before he set it down. Literally 16 seconds of fuel left. And then, of course, there was nobody there to take a picture of Neil coming out of the lunar module. So this is a picture that Neil Armstrong took of Buzz Aldrin coming down the ladder about 20 minutes later. And it's interesting, Buzz Aldrin says, when it was my turn to back out of the lunar module, I remembered the checklist said to reach back and carefully close the hatch, being careful not to lock it. And then as soon as he stepped down, you remember, of course, Neil's famous words when he stepped off the landing gear onto the lunar surface. One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. And one of Buzz's first words on the surface was magnificent desolation.
You have a picture of who's stepping on it?
Do I have a picture of that? I don't think I put one of those
I got
pictures.
one.
You do? Okay. Yeah. And here you see, again, these are pictures of Buzz Aldrin taken by Neil Armstrong. Here Buzz is by the solar wind experiment that they had set up. Here's the Eagle lunar module. And then here he's just turned around. You can see Neil Armstrong's reflection in his visor here, taking the picture. So in this picture, Neil is standing by the lunar module, taking the picture of Buzz the other way. And here's Buzz Aldrin saluting the flag after they planted the flag on the surface. You can see the footprints. Those footprints are still there. There's no atmosphere on the moon, so there's no wind. The only thing that will cover these footprints will probably take literally thousands of years, and as meteors impact the moon and kick up dust, although there's no atmosphere, there is gravity, that dust will filter back down and eventually very, very slowly recover these footprints, but not even close to being covered yet. Here he is getting ready to get back in the lunar module. From my laser pointer here down, that part is still on the moon. The astronauts climb back up, and then this top part is the part that blasts off, goes back up into lunar orbit, and docks with the command module. And on one of the legs of the bottom part of the lander is the plaque that is still on the moon. This is the actual picture of it through the steps that the astronauts climb down on. And this is what it actually says. This isn't a real one, but it's a picture of the Earth, and it says, "Here, men from the planet Earth first set foot upon the moon, July 1969 AD. We came in peace for all mankind." It's signed by Armstrong, Collins, and Aldrin, as well as President Nixon. And here's just a picture now that Collins took of Buzz and Neil coming back up in the lunar module just before they dock, with the Earth in the background. Quite a picture. And this is a picture taken by the astronauts as they're leaving the moon on the return flight to Earth. Very nice photograph, high definition photograph. So this would have been on July 21st. And this is the splashdown, the recovery by the Navy aircraft carrier USS Hornet. This is the frogmen who got the astronauts now out of the capsule into the recovery boat, picked up by a helicopter, and brought back to the aircraft carrier. And when they arrived back at Ellington Field in Texas, they were in quarantine for 21 days because we weren't sure if they'd bring moon germs back to Earth. So here they're looking out the window at their wives, probably wishing they could give them a hug, but they can't for 21 days. So they stayed in quarantine that long. All right, so this is just, I think, my last or second to last slide. So right now, we're marking the 50th anniversary of those manned Apollo missions. And that sequence of missions runs the 50th anniversary from October of last year through December of 2020, which would be the 50th anniversary of Apollo 17. There were 11 piloted Apollo missions. 12 astronauts walked on the surface of the moon between July 69 and December of 72. Today, NASA is working to return astronauts to the moon within the next 5 years. It's been a very bold plan to really accelerate the manned spaceflight program of NASA. The President has assigned Vice President Mike Pence as the leader of the National Space Council, which hasn't been used in several decades, and they have challenged NASA to return an astronaut, which will include a female astronaut, to the south pole of the moon by 2024. And pretty amazing. And that's all being done, as you can tell from this logo with the moon here. This is Mars over here. So it's all being done with an eye toward that first human mission to another planet. We've never set foot on another planet. And then we now live in a time when somebody in your generation will probably be that first human being to set foot on another planet. Think about that. It's pretty interesting. And so the reason we are going to the moon again is called Forward to the Moon, On to Mars. That's the name of the program. And one thing we didn't do with Apollo is we never built a lunar base. But when we go to Mars, the astronauts are going to have to stay on the surface for a while. So we need to learn how to do that. We're also going to be putting an orbital outpost around the moon. It's like a mini space station. It's called Gateway. And that is scheduled to occur before 2024. And then eventually, we'll put people on.
One of them is going to be a woman.
Yeah, well, there will be.
Yeah.
The first ones that will land back on the moon will definitely include a female astronaut. We have lots of female astronauts now. They were all men back in the Apollo days. And if you're interested, that would be another whole talk in and of itself, the NASA's current plans. But if you want to research that, you just go to nasa.gov. This, if you can remember that, that'll bring you right to the Moon to Mars program. But you can just go to nasa.gov if that's all you remember, and type in Moon to Mars, and it'll find this for you. It'll give you all the information on the renewed manned exploration program back to the Moon and on to Mars. So I'll stop there and take any questions you might have.
You notice that the camera that is set on the moon, you didn't see any pictures of it. I took a while to get it.
Yeah, that's right, because you worked on
Yeah, I looked up.
on the camera itself or the electronics?
No, electronic.
The electronic.
Camera was built, I think, on the camera, Kodak.
Interesting.
The electronics, the box that went underneath it.
Yep,
You can get a picture of it, you know.
really.
Yeah.
You know, it's amazing. I've given talks like this before.
It's taken a picture.
Yep.
And there'd be a transfer by the back, you know.
Yep. Well, it's amazing how many people, you know, if I give talks like this, will come up or during the talk like yourself and say, you know, I worked on the Apollo program in this aspect or that. Literally, you know, thousands, tens of thousands of people
All over the United States.
all over the United States. And again, this is why the Apollo 11 astronauts left their names off the mission patch. Because if it wasn't for everybody else and you doing your part, they wouldn't have had that camera
Yeah.
available to take those pictures that they did on the moon.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Not a question, but talking about Chris and
Mhm.
as I recall, he's about drowned on Mercury 2,
That's right.
his capsule sunk.
That's right. That's right.
And so he probably should have quit at that point.
Yeah, that's right. I know, that was maybe some, if any of you seen the movie The Right Stuff? Yeah, they pointed out how Gus was kind of treated pretty poorly after that. It's never really clear. He blew the hatch.
Before they put him.
Right. But some people claim that he did it because he was afraid, which is maybe true. I mean, who wouldn't be, you know? But he was thinking maybe that it was sinking, but it was designed not to sink. There was enough air in there to keep it afloat. When you blow the hatch, then that's when the water can come in. But at least he got out, and no loss of life. Huh?
Did you ever find out why that one blew up on the launch pad?
Oh, yes. Yes, they investigated that and know for sure. It was a wire that wasn't properly insulated that had a short. And it was just probably nothing more than the slightest little spark. But it was enough to set off that 100% pure oxygen.
Yeah, first they thought it was somebody got out of a cab and blew up.
Oh, okay, yeah. Yeah.
I have a couple of questions. I've often heard that the flag is laying on the ground. Is that true?
There are different things that I've heard, and this is interesting because what I heard was that actually made sense when I first heard it. Was, you know, there is no atmosphere on the moon, so there's nothing to protect against solar radiation, right? I mean, we'd get fried if we were just out in the sun with no atmospheric protection, without the spacesuits and that kind of thing. And you guys all know what exposure to the sun does to plastic. That flag was actually made of, there was a fabric, but there's also kind of a plastic component to it. And if you remember the picture, it kind of looked like it was blowing in the wind. Well, it wasn't. You know,
There was a stick on the top.
There is gravity on the moon, 1/6 of Earth's gravity, but you can see there's a post here to hold it up, and there's a post at the top. Otherwise, the flag would droop down. But what Buzz did was he just took that kind of plasticky kind of fabric and just, you know, went roughly to make it look like it's blowing in the wind. And the thought was, with that many years, 50 years of solar radiation on a plastic and a fabric, it's going to degrade it, and it's just going to fall apart. and be on the ground. But with the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter now, which we have flying over the moon, which takes those incredible photographs and can take close-ups too, we've even with good telescopes from Earth seen where the Apollo lunar module, the bottom part, is sitting, right? And we can even see the rovers. But with the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, we can see where the flag was, and guess what? There's a shadow.
Huh.
There's a shadow from the flag. Now, I don't know, in this picture, I guess the shadow goes this way. If you turn the light up, maybe I can tell. But obviously, when the sun is at a certain angle, that shadow would be more pronounced. So the indication that NASA thinks is that doggone flag didn't decay, and it's still up there like that.
You can see the shadow in the flag.
Yeah, well, you're right. It would have to go this way.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it's so thin, though, I can't really make it out. This, I guess, is just a, I don't know what that is, if that's a shadow or just a depression. But the astronaut shadow is this way. And they did go to the moon. There's a lot of people said, oh, if you look at the shadows, they're on the moon. No, they went to the moon. And so, I guess
There's
I see
some other things over the other side, that bottom.
maybe. Yeah, I can't really tell that right now, because again, it's hard. The sun would be almost directly in front of Buzz going that way. So since the flag is pointing in that direction, the shadow would be very thin on this side. Yeah.
Oh, that's probably from some other part of the capsule or something like that.
Yeah.
I'm assuming they planted a flag on all of the
Yes. Every mission has an
underground missions.
American flag planted there. Yep. Yep. There were six manned missions that made it to the surface. And another one?
Yeah, I have one other question.
Yeah.
I've often heard, like astronauts, if this is true, astronauts can only currently be on the space station for a certain period of time because of weightlessness.
6 months. Well,
How-
radiation, really.
How are they, that's obviously a limitation for going to Mars, because you're gonna have to be in weightlessness for much longer than 6 months to get to Mars.
Right.
How is NASA, I mean, that's a big hurdle.
Right. So it's actually not the weightlessness that's the limiting factor, it's the radiation level.
Okay.
So you are right, and one of the astronauts actually was up for a year. He had to get special approval for that. He's the one that had the identical twin
That
brother.
was
Right.
Kelly?
Yeah,
Yeah.
right.
I'm reading
And so-
Endurance right now.
Oh, okay, great. Oh, cool. And so they were looking at the impacts, biological impacts to him from that year compared to his brother. And the period is 6 months. And so with the radiation level that a human would get on the International Space Station, which has some protection but not a lot, they figured that the cancer risk is too high after 6 months, so that's why they limit them to that.
I see.
But you're right, because one of the other things they're looking at now, it's an 8-month mission to Mars, just to get to Mars.
Right, right.
And is how to protect the astronauts, how to have a certain area of the spacecraft available to them to be able to go into, not only just to be away from background radiation, but when the solar flares occur, they're called CMEs, coronal mass ejections, they're what cause the northern lights. They're electrical storms that shoot out of the sun. Well, if they happen to shoot out in the direction of Earth, it's electrified gas, very high in radiation, that takes about 1 million miles an hour, about 2 days to reach the Earth. So we see it with the SOHO telescope 8.5 minutes after it occurs, because that's the speed of light. But then it takes that electrified gas 2 days to reach the Earth if it's shot out in our direction and go through. Now, if an astronaut was not in Earth's atmosphere like us and is in a spacecraft unprotected by atmosphere and is in the path of a coronal mass ejection, then they get a tremendous amount of radiation all of a sudden. So NASA is working to develop materials that will be able to protect them and shield, in essence, to shield them from it. In other words, they might say, okay, there's a coronal mass ejection, it's going to hit the spacecraft in, 23 hours, and 22 hours, you guys get inside the protective area. And those are the kinds of things that.
So just to clarify, it's not the weightlessness that's the issue, it is
The
radiation.
weightlessness affects them, but the 6-month criteria is based on radiation, right? But you're
So how
absolutely-
does weightlessness affect?
That affects them, and we're getting a lot better at that, at the exercise that the astronauts do on the space station. So they have, a large part of their day actually is devoted to exercise to keep them healthy. Because you lose bone mass if you're not exercising and you're not pushing against, something, just standing here in gravity keeps my bones and the calcium in my bones and the muscles in my legs strong. But without that, you atrophy.
Right.
And there was a experiment that the Soviets did with, I don't even remember the fellow's name. He was a Soviet astronaut, and he was up in space for a year alone. And they brought him back after being in weightlessness for a year. He lost over 30% of the calcium in his hips. I didn't even think he could walk. And then, of course, psychologically, he was in a bad way because he was alone all that time. And so it was not good, But those are the things that NASA actually studies a lot. And it's interesting, we had a student who went through our space grant program, a young lady from Harding County. It's an interesting story, just a little background. She actually was studying to become a PA, a physician's assistant, but she was getting her engineering degree first at the School of Mines. And because of her career interest, helping people with physical disabilities, she agreed to be the aide for another School of Mines student who was a paraplegic. And he got a NASA internship at Johnson Space Center. And she agreed to go down with him during the day when he would get, actually she would come and pick him up and give him a ride to the Space Center. And they set him up in a special workstation where he could do his research for that 10-week period. And she was there to help assist him with all of those activities. And as a result of that, she fell in love with NASA. So she came back that next year. He had a great time doing his internship. And she says, Tom, how can I get an internship at NASA? So she ended up then applying the next year, got accepted, and she worked for the chief neurosurgeon at NASA and developed tests to run on the astronauts when they came back from the International Space Station on what's called the vestibular system. You guys familiar? It's a thing in our inner ears that keeps us balanced, right? Well, when astronauts who've been up in the space station for 6 months in weightlessness all of a sudden come back to Earth, there's all sorts of changes to the body. Your eyes change, you can't see well, your balance is all off, and to test that, you have to do those tests within the first hour of landing back on Earth. So she developed the protocol. At that time, we're still not sending our own astronauts back and forth. They had to send those tests to Kazakhstan, which is where they landed in the Soyuz spacecraft, and do those tests on them right after they landed. And
That's interesting.
just interesting because, she really enjoyed that period. She's now went back and she went to medical school, and she's no longer working for NASA, but she worked for a short time after she graduated as a contractor for NASA, testing the astronauts. So there's all sorts of human health research going on that we're learning from that we will need to know when we send that first crew to Mars.
Is the United States still sticking to the water landing versus Russia lands on land?
Oh, no, no, because in the Apollo days, right, the capsule landed in the water, but then after Apollo, we developed, the shuttle. And so the shuttle, would land on the runway, right? And whereas with the Russians, what they do with the Soyuz is they actually land very similarly to Apollo, but at the very last minute, before the bottom of the capsule hits the ground, there's an explosive explosion that basically just buffers the impact. And it works really well. There's a little bit of a jolt, but I mean, it works. Nobody that I know of has ever gotten injured from it. So they can land on land.
So the new moon missions they have planned,
Mhm.
will they use a space shuttle type vehicle to land, or?
That's a good question, probably not,
So,
probably not.
but it's going to come down on land as opposed to the ocean then? or-
Oh, you're on Earth, I'm sorry.
I'm talking
Yeah.
about, yeah.
Let's see, let me think a minute now.
Because the space shuttle is much
Yeah.
different than the Soyuz, because that's a capsule, that's not really.
Yes, so the answer to that is yes, and it's called the Orion capsule. We've already built it, we've already tested it, but the Orion capsule is designed to land in water. It's like a
Water.
big Apollo capsule, and it's already built, and we're building the rockets, which doesn't even have a name yet. It's called the SLS, but it's the Space Launch System. It's the powerful rocket that would be required to send crewed mission to Mars. It's not done yet, we're building it. And NASA just recently gave the name to this forward to the moon onto Mars mission. They're calling it Artemis. And I had to look that up. Artemis was the sister of Apollo in Greek mythology.
Oh, okay.
Isn't that interesting? No. No. So,
Thank you very much.
thank you guys for
Yeah, thank
coming.
you.
Good questions. Yeah.
Wait, we're not-